in a world filled with life, you might think there's an easy answer to this question: what is life? Turns out it's harder than you might think. There is no single definition of what life is. But all life on Earth shares a set of characteristics, so I'll just summarize a few of those, which will lead me into the later topics. So, all life is an organized connection of organic molecules, mainly water and carbon, actually, and if you add up the value of all the elements inside of our bodies, you get a value of about 250 francs. So, collectively, we're not actually worth that much. What else? Well, all life on Earth is based on the cell. There are different types, but from single-celled bacteria to multicellular creatures to trees, all life is based on a cell. And all organisms on Earth can be broadly constructed from a set of about 28 molecules. We have about 20 amino acids, which are shared by all life. We need 2 sugars. We need 5 nucleotide bases for the RNA and DNA, and a phosphate molecule. And from that set of bricks, we can construct the heart and workings of life. And as you well know, the DNA molecule is the code that contains the information that runs our bodies, that tells us what we're going to be. It's a beautifully complex molecule, but it's really just a computer code that tells what amino acids are to be combined to make proteins, and that's the molecule that is used most widely for many different tasks in our body. Less well known is the RNA nucleic acid, and this is quite a special molecule. I'll come back to it later, but it's involved with all the aspects of protein translation and transcription, and it's a single-sided helix, very similar to DNA, but it uses a different sugar molecule, that's all. But we'll come back to that in a little while. So if I wanted to summarize what life is in a sentence, then I would say life is an imperfect, self-replicating molecular machine. And imperfect is actually necessary because it's the mutations and errors in the DNA copying that give rise to the possibility for natural selection, for evolution to take place. So this is a simple bacteria dividing and replicating, speeded up by a rate of 1,000. It might look quite scary, but in fact, this is one of your very distant ancestors on the screen right here. So, in the beginning, there was a cell. You see the little animation on the right there. It shows the general evolution of life from a single-celled organism, the last common ancestor. And there is no biologist, I think, that would disagree that all life on Earth originated from a single cell. If you'd reconstruct the genetic history of all the 3 domains of life, they all share common genes, and from that you can construct a picture for what the first life on Earth looked like, the last common ancestor of all of us, of all life. And that's depicted on the left there. Very simple cell with a single strand of DNA in a liquid cytoplasm that contains those RNA and RNA ribosomes that are so important for the protein construction. So, if we accept this evolution of complexity from a single cell to the beautiful creatures on Earth, ourselves, elephants, and trees, that's a massive increase in complexity from 1 trillion atoms in a single cell to 10 to the 24 atoms in a large multicellular creature. How did that first cell arise? Could we not explain its origin in a similar series of evolutionary steps, from a few atoms, a few molecules, up to that first replicating cell? And this is the theory of abiogenesis. It's the idea that life spontaneously emerged in a primordial soup of pre-existing organic molecules. This was an idea that was proposed in the 1920s by Alexander Oparin and John Haldane separately. It's a very beautiful idea, and it's one that is actively explored today. There's no consensus about this idea, but there are certain well-defined steps that research has come up with. So we need some pre-existing organic molecules as building blocks that could come together into a first replicating structure. And the first experiments to show that organic molecules could arise in nature. Organic molecules is carbon linked to some other atoms and elements like hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and so on, the building blocks of life. Stanley Miller and Harold Urey in the 1950s did these pioneering experiments where they took inorganic matter and they tried to simulate the early conditions on Earth, the primordial atmosphere. And what they found in their experiment, that indeed they could reproduce from simple elements, inorganic matter, the amino acids and sugars and some of the building blocks of life. Although there is no consensus about how that last common ancestor came to be, there are some beautiful ideas, and one of the nicest I like is by the Scottish biochemist John Cairns Smith. He has investigated the idea that life before that first cell, which was based on DNA, was actually based on this RNA molecule, and this is called the RNA world. And Cairns Smith showed that you can spontaneously generate strands of RNA molecules on clay beds in a sort of mineral-rich water. And he did this experimentally in the laboratory. RNA is so important because it can also hold a genetic code, but it also can act as an enzyme to facilitate the replication of other RNA molecules. So this RNA world, that life was based on this RNA, is a beautiful idea. It's still being explored. But where did this all take place? This is a picture of our early Earth by the artist Chelsea Bonestell from 1955. It's quite an accurate representation. Our Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago. And shortly after its formation, a planet the size of Mars collided with the Earth, and that led to the formation of our moon, which you can see glowing hot in the back of the picture there. And at that time, the moon was 10 times closer to the Earth, and over time it has drifted away. And that collision left the Earth molten hot. There was no life at this stage on Earth. There was no oxygen in the atmosphere. It was just carbon dioxide and ammonia and methane. So this is not when life occurred. It couldn't happen here. But it did emerge shortly after. The first signs of life, the evidence of life on Earth, appeared about 3.8 billion years ago, about 500 million years after its formation. And this is some of the evidence here. These are fossilized stromatolites. They're like tree rings, layers of minerals that are deposited by bacterial surfaces in the oceans 3.8 billion years ago. You still find these stromatolites filling the oceans today. So this is what they look like, and you've probably seen them and stepped on them. And this is the earliest evidence for life on Earth. Indeed, most biologists, evolutionary biologists working on abiogenesis may think that life developed in the oceans, and perhaps in an ocean tide pool that was gently washed by the waves, bringing in minerals onto that clay subsurface so that self-replicating RNA molecules could be generated and appear and then undergo evolution to that last common ancestor. But this idea of a nice quiet tide pool, well, it doesn't quite make sense to me because it takes quite a long time for these processes to happen. Estimates range from about 1 million years or so. And 3.8 billion years ago, when life emerged, the moon was actually still moving away into its current position. It was 2 or 3 times closer to the Earth. And at that time, the Earth was spinning longer, so the length of the day was just 12 hours. Now, what this means is when the Earth is 2 or 3 times closer, the tides on the Earth go as the cube of the distance to the moon. So today, the ocean tides are about 1 meter high. Back when life appeared on Earth, the ocean tides were between 10 and 30 meters high, and they were happening every 6 hours. So you had a tidal wave like this passing over the surface of the Earth. This idea of a quiet ocean tide pool doesn't quite make sense to me. This was not the conditions, I think, where life developed. So I've been exploring the idea that the last common ancestor of all life may have evolved inside a giant asteroid in space. So I'd like to try and convince you of this in the remaining 8 minutes. And this is a picture of the Vesta asteroid. It's about 500 kilometers across. our solar system is still filled with these objects, but when the Earth was forming, and for those first few 100 million years after its formation, there was literally hundreds of thousands of these asteroids in the solar system orbiting around. You see a smaller one on the left of that picture. The larger the asteroid, the stronger its gravity, and it can eventually pull itself into a spherical shape once you get to about 500 kilometers across. So how can I convince you of this? Well, let's first look at the Earth. If you take away all the water on Earth and all the carbon, you can fit them into those two little spheres there. Our Earth, as a percentage, is just 0.05% water and 0.01% water, whereas life is actually constructed mainly of those elements and molecules. Life is 60% water and 20% carbon. And the recent evidence shows, when you actually look at the isotopes of the water and where it came from on Earth, that all the water on Earth originated in asteroids. And asteroids are actually very rich in water and carbon. If you take a carbonaceous chondrite asteroid that are still common in the solar system and that have landed on Earth today, you can look at how much water and carbon they have. You can compare them with the water on Earth. And asteroids like this, that's actually 10% water and 4% carbon on average. So they're quite liquidy, aqueous environments. If you look inside of an asteroid, then early on after they formed, this is what their structure would look like. There would be a hot inner molten core that has differentiated and sunk down to the center. It's hot and molten from its formation, but also from the radioactive decay of elements like aluminium and thorium and so on. And surrounding that hot inner core is a liquidy, warm, mineral-rich environment. And as you go further to the surface, you get into a cold, liquidy water, silicate, clayey, porous medium. And this is the environment within which organic molecules can spontaneously form and perhaps combine and lead to the last common ancestor of life, that first cell. The surface of these asteroids is just a dusty, icy, cold vacuum, so that's not where life could have originated. But inside these objects, they're shielded from the cosmic rays. They're nice environments, actually. And there's some compelling evidence of this idea. This is the Murchison meteorite that landed in Australia in the 60s. It's a piece of it. And it was very quickly collected and stored in laboratories, parts of it. And the most recent analysis of the content of this meteor shows a range of organic molecules that had formed inside of that meteorite. In fact, there are over 14,000 different polymers, long chains of molecules. Over 100 amino acids, different amino acids, have been identified within this asteroid. Remember, life just needs 20 of those. 27 different sugar molecules were in there. 5 of the purines and pyrimidines. These are the nucleotide bases that hold the genetic code in the DNA and the RNA. There's even alcohol in there, so life could have a party once it got started. 650 molecules per million. So in a kilogram of this asteroid, you had 10 to the 20 organic molecules. So how do these objects get to Earth? They form in the outer solar system where water can condense onto them and carbon. And this is one of our supercomputer simulations that follows the formation of Earth-like planets. And from these calculations, we can look at the collisional history. We can identify how many of these giant asteroids actually impacted on Earth and when. So you're going to see an evolving set of planetesimals, which will eventually form some planets. And they're color-coded like this. The yellow is the region too close to the sun where water will be evaporated. And the green is the so-called habitable zone where liquid water could exist on planets. And the blue is the far reaches of the solar system. But it's in those outer reaches where asteroids and comets can form, filled with water and carbon, and they can be delivered into the inner solar system. So we start off with basically tens of thousands of planetesimals orbiting a star, and I've speeded up the calculation because planets form on a time scale of about 10 million years, so we don't want to sit here and watch 10 million rotations. What we're seeing is the averaged orbits over time. And we follow the collisions between all these small bodies as they merge together, get larger and larger, and grow in time. And the hope is that gravity and collisions between these rocky objects, small rocky objects, can eventually lead to planets terrestrial planets like our Earth. And you see the number is going down. Quite a lot of these actually fall into the sun, pulled there by the gas drag. The orbits get elongated as the bodies get larger and perturb their trajectories, and you see the number is going down, and the objects are slowly getting larger over time. And it's from this calculation actually runs with a new computer code we just wrote, which actually runs entirely on the graphics processing units of our computers. And from these calculations, we can look statistically at what planets around other stars may be like. And as we heard last ZURICH.MINDS, almost every star we look at in the night sky has got its own planetary system going around it. So at the end of this calculation, this particular one, you see there are 2 planets there orbiting a star in the hot zone. There is one Earth-like planet orbiting there in the habitable zone. So gravity, collisions between these tiny rocks will eventually form planetary systems. And it's from these sorts of calculations we can look at where the water on Earth came from, where the carbon on Earth came from, and perhaps also link this to the origin of life, if life itself evolved first inside of one of these giant asteroids. So all it would take is one single cell to fall onto Earth intact for all of the life we see to develop from. One cell, that's all it would take. And, well, these collisions between asteroids are still taking place today. Giant objects will hit our planet every 50 million years or so. So they're a little bit less common. Early in the solar system, these collisions were very frequent. And they can be quite violent. Today, they can lead to mass extinction events. But the impact would not destroy the life within these objects. Pieces and chunks of the rock would be scattered off, they would land all over the planet. The G-forces you can calculate are easily withstandable by a single-celled organism. You can spin a bacteria around at 1 million times the gravitational strength on Earth, and they're still quite happily reproduce. So why did life begin 3.8 billion years ago? Why didn't it begin earlier? Because we think there was an ocean and atmosphere quite before that time. Well, there is an interesting piece of evidence that the Earth was bombarded with massive objects 3.8, 3.9 billion years ago. And that comes from looking at the moon. So when you look at the moon, you will see some patches on it. Like, if you look through binoculars, you will see them more clearly. These are giant impact craters. Objects collided with the moon 50, 100 kilometers across. And because we've actually been to the moon and brought back rocks, we can date these collisions. These 5 largest impacts on our moon, you can see the ages there in billions of years ago. They happened between 3.8 and 3.9 billion years ago. Now, they are preserved on the moon because the moon has no plate tectonics and atmosphere, so we can still see the relics. The Earth is much larger, so at the same time, if the moon got struck by at least 5 massive objects, the Earth would have had at least 30 or so collisions at this period of time called the late heavy bombardment. And there's no evidence left of these collisions on Earth because the Earth is resurfaced, but perhaps one of those impacts at that time deposited that last common ancestor of all life on Earth. And I'm just going to wrap up in the last 30 seconds here. It's quite a special day as well for science because, as you've probably read in the news, the Rosetta mission is taking place over the last 10 years, in fact. But today, the lander has been released. It's on its way down to the surface. If all goes well, there'll be a probe landing on this comet in the next few hours. And what we've learned already about this giant lump of rock is that it's very loosely dense. It has a density less than that of water. It's the size of Mount Everest, but it would float in the ocean. It's a very porous thing. That was something we've learned already. Perhaps if the lander is successful, then we will learn more about the possible building blocks of life on this object.